Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to part 3 of Embrace the Rhythm with your BERNINA 880. If you've attended the first 2 sessions, you know what's in store this morning with Debbie and Sarah. If you missed the first 2, the recordings will be posted in the next day or so, but don't worry, you missed stuff, but you won't be lost this morning. It will be fine. So I'm going to turn this over to Debbie and Sarah, but a few housekeeping items. If you're having any kind of visual or audio troubles, I would recommend just closing out of GoToMeeting and coming back. If you still have troubles, there's a little audio panel in the GoToMeeting control panel that can possibly help you out. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we will try to get to them at the end of the webinar. This is very well attended, and there's been lots of wonderful questions, so we may not get to them all. And I think that's it. So I'm going to turn it over to Debbie and Sarah and have a very wonderful webinar, and I'll see you in a few.
Thank you, Heather. Morning, Sarah.
Hi, how are you? Yeah.
I'm good. How are you?
You ready to read?
Oh, yeah.
And we didn't
Gotta
really
wear
organize
red,
it.
right? For sure. All right, so let's get started. This is our part 3 of Embrace the Rhythm of your 880. This morning, we're going to talk about security functions and specialty threads. So, hold on a minute. There we go. Okay, so why do we need security functions anyway? What are they for? So they are there to help us protect us from breaking our needles. That's one of the biggest ones. It protects us from breaking even other things. I'll tell you a story about that in a little while. To make our sewing processes easier and more precise. And to help our B880 help us sew better. So those are the basic reasons why we need these things. So let me show you just a few of them. We're not going to go through all, but some. So the ones I'm going to talk about are the needle and stitch plate, presser foot security, the securing stitch at pattern begin, and the securing stitch attached to the thread cutter. So the first one is the needle and stitch plate security. So this is where we find this. On your screen of your machine on the left-hand side, you will see a picture of a needle. And normally it's the one with the yellow star, which is the standard single needle. But if you select a different needle, for example, if you like to do twin needle work, and you choose the twin needle that you are using, the actual size of them, then when you select that, you'll see on the left-hand side that the needle looks like a twin needle and it's in yellow, so you know that you've made that selection. So why is this important? Because it prevents you from breaking that needle. If you tell the machine that you're using a twin needle, if you chose a decorative stitch or a zigzag or anything that's wider than a straight stitch, it will keep your stitch width in the right distance so that your needles don't hit the stitch plate. Okay, so that's really important. And if you think about it, it's actually really important that you can choose the exact width of your twin needle. So some people haven't ever used a twin needle, but they are super fun. And they make the most beautiful double looking stitches, and you should try them out. So the way they're labeled is there's like as you see on the screen, a 1.0, 1.6, 2.0. That's actually the millimeter distance between the two needles. So it goes all the way up to 8, which is really wide, almost as wide as our 9mm stitch plate. So there's a big range, and just make sure you choose the one on the screen that fits the needle you're going to use. So the next thing is the stitch plate. So normally our machines come from the factory in the box with a 9mm stitch plate on, and that is the one with the yellow star that you see at the bottom of the screen. But if you were using a straight stitch plate, which is the one that I have selected, the 0mm, you'll see that on the left-hand side, it actually changes that to 0mm and it turns yellow. So here's the deal about the straight stitch plate. The straight stitch plate comes in the box with your 880. So that's a good thing, right? you should always use a straight stitch plate when you're doing straight stitch work because it supports the needle all the way through the creation of the stitch. So I kind of had it explained to me this way by one of our techs. If you had a 9mm stitch plate, so wider, right? And the hook comes up, there is a little bit of space there, that 9mm range, for the hook to catch the needle thread. But if you have a straight stitch plate on, then the hook is forced, the bobbin thread is forced to come straight under the needle to catch that needle thread. And that makes your straight stitch more precise even than if you were using a 9mm stitch plate, just because of mechanically how it works. Okay, so when you're doing piecing or any kind of straight stitch work, put on the straight stitch plate and tell the machine you're using it. So that way, if you happen to go choose a different stitch, it won't let you, it will let you sew the stitch, but it will just look like a straight stitch. It will just collapse the stitch down. So really important security functions, both of these, whenever you are setting up your machine to do a project. Next is the presser foot security. So this one is really important, and I have a story about this one. This one is really important because it protects you when you are doing something and you have an unusual foot on. So as you see in my screen, I have the 1D foot selected. And on the left side, you'll see there's a yellow indicator that I have the 1D foot on. So I want you to know that the needle, stitch plate, and the presser foot security functions. If you shut your machine off today and come back in tomorrow, those will still be yellow and turned on the way you left them, because they are a security function that protects you from breaking things, right? So do you have to or must you select the foot you're using? You can shut this off. The way to do that is to open this screen, touch the clear button at the bottom right, or you can just select that foot that I have so it shuts it off. And then all the feet are selected. So the important thing about that is if you, the machine actually knows sort of, kind of, almost what foot you're using. Not specifically the foot, but by groups. So those crystals, those reflectors are on the top of the foot. The machine reads those electronically and knows sort of what grouping of foot that is. It might know that it's a D foot, a dual feed foot. It might know that it's a C foot, which means coded for 9mm wide. It might know that it's a straight stitch foot. So there are ways the machine knows what you're doing without you having to tell it. So there is some security that way, but the real security happens if you tell the machine what foot you're using. And like I said, you don't have to, but there are some feet in which you should do that. Ask me how I know. So for these feet, you should always use presser foot selection, a ruffler number 86, because you can see how big it is. If you tried to thread the needle and that needle threader comes around, there's no way that's going to work, right? So the leather roller foot number 55 is also one that you should make sure that you use your presser foot selection. So what happened to me was I was working on a project, I took a phone call, I come back to the machine and I thread my machine, and I didn't tell the machine that I was using the leather roller foot. So, you know, we all make mistakes. As soon as I hit that threader button, I knew I was in trouble. And the machine, the threader hit the foot because it's in the way. It sits to the left of the needle, right? And so, yeah, I did break a few things, but, you know, we got it fixed. And then the last one is the binder attachment, number 88. So if you're ever not 100% sure, should I thread it before I put the foot on or thread it after I put the foot on, it's also good to err on the safe side. So you can thread your machine without a presser foot on. And most feet, you can thread it with the presser foot on. It really doesn't matter except for these particular feet. So next is the one called securing stitch at pattern begin. So where do we find that? So if you go to your gears on the right-hand side of your machine, that's called the setup, and touch the sewing icon, which is the straight stitch zigzag icon. And then on that page, you will see an icon that looks like a needle and a securing stitch underneath it. So in my screen, you'll see I have it turned off. The default from the factory is turned on. So why do I care? Here's why. So this particular feature, because it's turned on as a default, will drop a knot or a lock stitch or a securing stitch, whatever you like to call it, 4 or 5 stitches all in one place. And it will do that at the beginning of every stitch. So you start to sew, you put your foot on the foot control, you see this knot thing happen, and then it will start your stitch. That's default on. So if you come in here and shut it off, then your stitch will start just at the stitch without the lock stitch. So here's the thing I want you to understand. So if you're one of those people who likes to start sewing off the edge of the fabric and drive into the fabric, then that knot could drop in the air, right? Because you're not in the fabric, and it could lodge in the hook mechanism. So as we talked about before, if you get stuff stuck around your hook mechanism, then you're going to get the picture of the big gears and the flashing red X on your screen. And you're going to think, oh, what's wrong with this machine? Well, sometimes it's what we're doing that causes things to happen. And if you drop a lock stitch in the air and it happens to get stuck in the hook mechanism, then you're going to have to clean that up before you can continue to sew. So if you're one of those people who likes to start in the air, and there are lots of quilters particularly, those of us that are garment sewers, that's not a normal thing for us. But in the quilting world, it seems to be. And so if you like to do that, it's okay. I would just turn this off. So the next one is the securing stitch attached to the thread cutter. So this one kind of has the same mindset as the one we just talked about. So you would go to the gears, you would select the straight stitch zigzag sewing icon, you would select the programming icon. It looks like a hand touching the buttons, and then you would select the scissors. So when you select the scissors, the default here is actually turned off, which is a good thing, I think, for some of us. But if you were doing a project and you wanted to touch the picture of scissors on the head of your machine, and you wanted it to give you a lock stitch before it cut the thread, you can come in here and turn it on. So the picture at the top is the securing stitch was turned off. That's the default. The one at the bottom, the securing stitch is turned on, and there are actually 2 options there. So you'll see just to the right of the knot, the picture of the securing stitch, there's a picture of 5 dots on the screen. That's the lock stitch is all in one place, and it's 5 stitches. The one that I have highlighted is called a running stitch, and it's a number of different very tiny stitches to going forward, just to lock the stitch in. That changes from a -2, so you can go down to 2 stitches in a running stitch or up to 6. So why am I bringing this up? Because the same thing can happen as we talked about with the pattern begin knot. If you drive off the end of your fabric and then you hit your scissors and it happens to have a lock stitch, securing stitch attached, then that knot is going to drop into the hook. So sometimes you get lucky and it doesn't cause a problem, but sometimes it does. It could depend on which kind of securing stitch you have selected. Either way, you won't know that it's caused you a problem until you start your next sewing moment. So when you start your next stitch, if you get that big gears with the flashing red X, then you'll know you dropped the knot and it got stuck. So depending on your project at hand and how you like to sew, you can set up your machine to behave the way you want it to behave so that it tells you things, or maybe it doesn't tell you things. So,
Debbie, can I say something quickly
of
here?
course, yes, please jump in.
I don't want to interrupt, but I just wanted to add to your wonderful information is that so many people do not realize that there is a line on the stitch plate just behind where the needle is, and that is actually where you should place your fabric, so you can be sure that the needle goes into the fabric rather than, as you say,
Into the air.
Into the air. And so many people mention that they have this nest, and it will not happen if you actually start on the fabric. So that's the whole reason why that. Have a look on your stitch plate next time you're at your machine, and you'll see that there's this lovely little marking just behind the needle that runs across the stitch plate.
So I think, Sarah, it sounds like you're like me. I have this pet peeve that you sew in fabric, you don't sew in air. That's just normal, right? But there are some who do start in the air. So it's okay. You just need to know how to set up your machine so that it's happy.
That's
Thank you
right.
about that line. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about specialty threads and the 880. So there are easy adjustments to top or bobbin tension based on the type of thread and your test stitch out. So you need to understand how and why to make these adjustments. So the two kinds of specialty threads I'm going to spend some time on are the metallic and the invisible threads. And a lot of, there are lots of very unique threads out there from all kinds of thread companies. And a lot of these techniques and suggestions I'm going to make today apply to across the board. So you might have to do some testing depending on what kind of specialty thread you may be using. So let's do a quick technical lesson first. On the 880, the thread passes through the eye of the needle 120 times per inch of sewing. And I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's true. So the way it works is, if you, let's say you took your thread and you threaded your machine and you took a Sharpie and put a mark just as the thread was entering into your machine at the top, it would take 120 times like this going through the needle to, by the time that mark got to the needle. So there's a lot of friction and a lot of motion that happens when a stitch is being created. So keep this in mind, especially when you're dealing with these specialty threads. So the next thing we need to talk about is thread tension and thread weight. And so the weight of your threads matters. So in the top part of this graphic, you'll see a green thread that is heavier, thicker than the red one. And when you have a heavier thread on the top, it pulls the bobbin thread up just because it's a heavier weight. And then the reverse is true. If you put a light weight on the top and a heavy on the bottom, your top thread is going to pull to the back side. So just understand that the weight of your thread matters. So I like to say, balance your stitch. So first thing you do, you get everything set up the way you think you want, and you do a test sew on the fabric using the needle and the thread that you plan to use for the project. Look at it. What do you actually see? And be discerning, like take a real look. Which way is the thread pulling? Or is it balanced already? Do you really expect the machine to do all the work for you? What you are choosing to put in your machine, thread, needle, fabric, is all part of what happens there. We tend to think we can just put anything through it and it should know what to do. But, you know, we have a job in this. We have a part in how things turn out. And so I want you to understand what your job is in this. So know that the basic parameters that are set at the factory are what they use, like from the technical side, to set up the machine for basic sewing. But they're not using our weird threads and our fancy threads and our unusual fabrics. So we have to adjust off of what they set it up as from the basic sewing. So you are in total control. This is the total control freak out moment, right? We are in control of our own stitches. You can change pretty much anything. And I think that's one of the best things about the 880 is that you're in control and you just need to take a look and make adjustments based upon that. So do you adjust your top tension? Do you adjust the bobbin tension? Do you use the same thread, top and bobbin, to balance the stitch naturally? I tend to do that a lot just because I'm ready to just move through and I want to do that. But there are times that I want to use a lighter weight bobbin thread, and then I have to really take a better look at what my stitch might look like. So think it through and take control of your stitches. Part of the journey of learning this machine and learning to sew and sewing well and doing it right is the fact that you are in control. And I think part of the fun of what we do, the relaxation of what we do, is taking control of it and embracing the uniqueness of every single thing that we do. So let's talk about thread next. Thread choice does matter. So are you using a polyester thread? Polyester threads are stronger than some others and relatively dust-free, which is a good thing. Bobbin thread is much lighter weight and it will affect how your stitch will look. It may pull to the top side of the fabric. Cotton threads, they are dustier. They're cotton, you know, so yes, they do drop more thread dust in your machine. You'll notice it right above the needle. You'll notice it in the bobbin area. You'll notice it here and there. So know that if you are a cotton thread only sewist, which is fine, that's okay, you will probably need to clean and oil your machine a little more than those of us who may use other types of threads, just because it gets more dust. So know that that thread lint and that thread dust soaks up the machine oil in your hook, right? So whenever I said to you Tuesday, oil your machine every other full bobbin, that's kind of general, but if you're a cotton thread sewer, just pay attention to the noise that the machine is making, because the 880 will definitely tell you when she's thirsty. When that machine needs oil, it will tell you. And then the mention of rayon threads, they are beautiful, they are shiny, they are a bit more fragile than polyester threads. They use them a lot for decorative stitching and for embroidery, but it does have a little more fragile to it. So a little bit of thread trivia today. So there are plies in threads, 2-ply, 3-ply. You might see that on thread spools. 2-ply is really 2 strands of thread twisted together to make one. And then the 3-ply are 3 strands twisted together to make one. So if you went online and just looked up thread twisting, you would find that there's an S twist to thread and a Z twist to thread. And this is not stuff you have to understand or really know. It's just a little trivia. So if you ever hear it out there, an S twist twists the thread one direction, and when it goes through a sewing machine, it actually untwists along the way because of how it's twisted. So the standard for domestic machines and long arm machines is the Z twist because it is twisted in the direction that it stays together as it goes through your machine. So there is a thing called the twist per meter ratio, which when I was doing research to do this, I thought this was an interesting little tidbit, like I've always said, we buy these great machines, we should buy great thread. Like, don't skimp on the thread. A $1 spool of thread is not going to behave well in, any machine, but, just think it through, right? So this is why I found out why this is an important thing. So I'm all about the why. So if you're using a thread that was a very inexpensive thread, number one, it will break easier, and it has a low twist rate, which means like around 150 twists per meter. But a good quality thread that is smooth and doesn't break all the time, that's 1,000 to 1,200 twists per meter. And just the numbers alone tell you why we need to really use good quality threads. So you will not find this information. You'll find a 2 and 3 ply on a spool, but the other stuff you won't find on a spool. But I think you needed to know it. So your thread choice does matter. So how a thread is wound on the spool actually matters. So what do I mean by that? It changes, the twist as it comes off the spool is different when it is wound on the spool differently. So on the left side of the picture, you'll see a spool of thread that is facing my left, and the thread is coming off the top of the spool going that direction. The one on the right, the spool is facing the same direction, but the thread is pulling off the top of the spool the opposite direction. So when it's released off the spool, it not only changes how it's released, but how your machine receives that. So I've heard people talk about, this machine is finicky. No, it's not. It's just that you have to understand how things work. So if I put that red spool on my machine, I put it upright like normal, and it sews like a dream. The one on the left, that was the red one. The gold spool, I'll try it that way. And if it seems to be twisting too much and like causing thread breaks, I'll flip the spool upside down on the spindle. It's a crisscross wound, so I can still put it on this upright spindle, but I flip it upside down. That way it pulls off the spool the other direction. And somehow magically that makes things all behave better. So there are, there are reasons why things happen. And we, as the consumer, need to understand that we have to take the steps to give the machine what it needs, and it will sew like a dream. So pay attention to your thread spools. And the easiest way to do that, of course, is to take the spool, hold it by the top side and wind it this way, or does it wind this way, the other direction? And it makes a difference. So, tidbits of information for you. So adjusting the top tension to fit the thread. So the first thing you do is you test sew. What does it look like? Do you add tension to the bobbin thread by using that added thread tension clip in the bobbin? Or do you use the top tension to adjust? I tend to, personally, this is just me, I tend to, if I saw a bobbin thread peeking to the top, I would add extra tension to the bottom just by threading it for extra tension, threading it for embroidery, so to speak. I would do that first. And then I would use my top tension to kind of fine tune it if I needed just a little bit more to make it be exactly what I want. You can also change the main bobbin tension if you felt you needed to, and that is all dependent on what kind of threads you're using, of course. All right, let's talk about metallic threads. Does the brand or type of thread matter? Well, first of all, buy good quality thread, because not all metallic threads are created equal. So I will name drop two brands. Mettler Metallic is a 60% polyester wrapped around a nylon cord. Okay. The Yenmet Metallic is also a nylon core and has a polyester film coating. So these two particular brands have a core in the thread and then wrapped with poly to work toward not to have it go through the machine smoothly. So I just have a couple of pictures of some of those pretty threads. They are fantastic and worth all the effort that we have to do. So there are several slides here with rules of metallic thread use. So the first one is to sew slower than normal. Metallic thread produces heat and friction at the needle and also at the tension disc. So the tension discs are metal too. So a metallic thread, you know, has metal and it goes through your tension discs, and the eye of the needle, remember 120 times per inch of sewing, that's a lot of rubbing and friction that happens. And that makes it more likely to break. So if you sew slower, there is less friction along the way and things don't heat up and they won't break as often. So yes, twisted metallic and core fibers can shred when sewing too fast. So the next thing I would do is decrease my top tension, because again, that produces heat and friction between the tension discs. So the next thing I would do is I would use an external thread stand. Even though on the 880 we have that thread stand on the side of the machine, sometimes, you know, you got to look at these. Did you ever watch thread come off the spool when it's a metallic thread? It like immediately twists and crinkles, and it's a very stressed out thread. So we have to give it time to relax. So I would use an external thread stand. I would put it back and away from the machine a bit and thread it normally from there, not too close to the hand wheel. You don't want it to get it caught in there. So back and away just a little bit. And that allows the thread to relax a bit before it goes through the machine and the tension. And you want to make sure you use the right needle type and size. So you can use a metallic needle, or because it has a larger eye. So use like a 90-14. I wouldn't go smaller than that when you're using metallic threads. A top stitch needle also has a larger eye. So those two, because of that. Now, I put the word ballpoint needle in here only because both metallic and top stitch needles are sharp needles. And so if you're doing stitching that you are doing a lot of, the stitch takes the needle in the same needle penetration holes multiple times, then your needle may be cutting the thread as you move through the stitch. And you really wouldn't think that was a thing, but that's a sharp needle and it could happen. So if you've tried a metallic and it isn't behaving right, and you've tried a top stitch and that's not behaving right, then try a ballpoint needle. But again, a size 90-14, and see if maybe that will help you prevent that breakage. This is all determined because of the stitch you've selected. So make sure that you have, you know, done a little test sewing to see what works best. You can also use a thread net to prevent twisting of the thread as it comes off the spool. Those are also included in the box with your machine. More rules. In sewing, you can adjust the stitch length a little bit longer because less needle penetrations equals less friction. In embroidery, some designs are digitized for metallic thread. And you can even do that in software if that's something that you would like to do. So the next thing I want to talk about is the thread lubricator. And that comes in the box with the 880 along with a small accessory, and I'll get to that in a second. This is the little silicone bottle of silicone that you put on on the sponge on the accessory to help your thread pass through your machine easier. So it is for threads with high friction values like metallic threads and all kinds of loosely twisted, unusual thread types. The silicone fluid improves the thread's gliding properties as it goes through your machine. So this is a picture of the accessory that fits on your machine. It comes in the box with the 880, and you wonder, what is this thing? Oh, it fits into the machine right on the side of the machine near that sensor, that threading sensor. And it just fits in that little, little clip there. It has a clip on the top right that you'll see. And then it has this little, little thing with a sponge in it. So when I use metallic threads, I always put this on the machine, and it will help guide your thread. And you use that little sponge where you put the silicone, just a drop or so. And then when you thread the machine, getting there, hold on. So you thread the machine, see the graphic on the right? You would thread the machine like normal, put the thread on the spool up through the guide above it, and then you would go through the clip, through the sponge, and then you would pull a length of thread and pull it into the first thread guide there, and just thread it normal from there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about using stacked threads. So far I've mostly talked about threads that come off the top of the spool with a crisscross wound. So sewing with stacked threads is just a little bit different. So in your box with your machine, there is a radial thread guide, and it's the one on the right that you see the red arrow that has the little plastic on the inside. So this is called a radial foam disc, radial thread guide. You put it on the rear spool holder on the machine, and this will help feed the thread more evenly when you're using a stacked thread. And the reason, and this is really any stacked thread, but it's even more important when it's a metallic stacked thread. So this ensures that there is consistent thread release from the spool. And just so you know, if you don't know where to find this, it's on pages 28 and 29 in your machine manual. And it's very clear. It's very well described in there. So here's a picture of, you would place the thread on the rear spool like you see, and then the thread will go through that thread guide over there on the right side. It's right between where the thread spools are and the bobbin winding spool is. Then you would take the thread up to the center eyelet of the telescopic rod. And that's the one that's usually used for the front spool, but for this, you use it for this. Pull an extra inch of thread from the spool before the threader button is pushed. So you take it up to that thread guide, and then you thread the machine as normal, and then give it a little tug over there on the right-hand side, and give it a little bit of gap, so that when the machine pulls it through, it doesn't pull too tightly. So if the thread is metallic, then you do the same thing, except then you're going to take it through the attached guide that I have shown here, just like we explained it initially, and it will go through that sponge with the silicone. And then you can see that they're pulling a length of thread there as they're threading the machine to make it easier to do so. So this process will help your metallic threads behave perfectly. So, you ready to move on? Let's do the invisible thread lesson next. Sewing with invisible thread on an 880 is, it's a little different, right? So there are really basically two types of invisible thread. One is a polyester and one is a nylon. The nylon is more like a fishing line, so it's a little more brittle. It might break more often, and know that it is heat sensitive. So if you hit an iron to a nylon invisible thread, it's going to melt, depending on how hot your iron is. So make sure you take a look at your invisible thread spools that you have in your stash and see what you've got there. There is a accessory spool pin for horizontal release, and it looks like what you see in the picture. And you put it so that the little guide at the far right of the spool that you see in the picture is facing up, because that will keep the spool on the guide. So you'll put that on your spool pin just like you see it. And this is kind of a unusual thing. So the problem with invisible thread is that the machine can't see it, right? So if you have that very clear, translucent, I can't see this thread, and you thread your machine, the machine might not even see it because it's so light and it's so fine and it's clear. And so how do you make the machine see it so you can thread the machine and it'll all behave well? So if you take two threads at the same time, so I put this thread on like you see it, and then I added a red, I think it was an isocord thread. It's just a heavier weight. It has color, so the machine will see it. So I put it on the rear spool, and I pulled them up to their thread guides at the top, and I held both together at the same time. And I put them both up in the first thread guide together, thread them all the way down in front of the needle together. Then before I threaded the needle, you cut the red thread over here by the spool pin, pull that red one out, and then thread the for the needle threading with just the invisible thread. And there is a process for that too. I'm getting there. So this is a very close-up picture of that thread presenter or the thread clip on the right side of the machine, where you push it in so that it right before you cut the thread on the left side. See this little white, there's an additional hook there that's vertical, and it's in that yellow circle. Whenever you use this invisible thread, you push it into the presenter and then go up and around that little hook on the back side of the presenter. And the first few times you do it, you kind of have to look for it because it's not real obvious, but that kind of holds on to that slippery, fine, invisible thread so that it holds on to it long enough that it can get to the needle. The needle size should be a 90-14. And yes, using a thread net with invisible threads is a good idea. Okay, some final thoughts here. Use the security functions to your best benefit, okay? Set them up whatever way works for you in your project today. And every time you start a new project, you might set it up differently, and that's perfectly fine. Be sure to use the correct needle for the thread type, weight, and the fabric that you're using. And just take control of your machine. Don't be afraid of it. She'll behave great for you. You just have to tell her what you're doing and assist it along the way. So you may adjust your tensions, top or bottom, that's not a problem. And you may thread the 880 for the thread that's being used. Thread it right. Do it my way. And always, always test sew. Sometimes I think we don't spend enough time testing before we start a project. So I would even say to you, what would be wrong with spending a day, half a day, just testing different things to see how you can make your machine behave the way you want it to, because you do have lots of choices. Okay, where do you find this recording? On BERNINA.com, hover over Learn and Create and select Recorded Webinars. Okay, let's see if we have any questions.
Well, we have a few, some really good ones today. All right, I'm going to start from the top. What causes a bobbin to wind unevenly?
On the 880, they wind pretty even. I really haven't had a lot of, I think it's just probably the weight of the thread. Sarah, you have a thought.
I have a thought that just check that the bobbin's pushed in far enough. And the other point is that the next time you take it in for service, if you don't feel like it's winding evenly, I would get the technician just to take a look that it's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. But sometimes it can get, as it winds, it depends on the texture of the bobbin thread. It can wind a little bit more on one part, but it shouldn't, most cases it's fine. I haven't seen that much happen.
Someone said they were told not to use a jean needle size 100, but the needle is listed in the manual. Can she use it?
I can take that one too, because I've had some wonderful experience with a young employee at BERNINA making a leather jacket for her mother, and she was using the 790 and then she went to the 880 and it just sewed like butter, and she used a 100 jeans needle. So I'm not sure where that information came from, but I've seen proof in the pudding. It works.
Yeah. I've used that needle too. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Great. What's the difference between a straight stitch plate and a cut work plate?
Well, we had 2 different plates, but most of our straight stitch plates we now use for cut work. It was the size of the hole, I believe, right, Sarah?
Absolutely. It was actually so that the cut work tool was just a little bit, they were concerned that maybe there needed to be a little bit more play, so that's why they introduced another another stitch plate for using the cut work tool.
Right. I know there's some other great questions here. Can you use the running securing stitch and not cut the threads? Does the running lock stitch work at the beginning and the end?
Well, let's see. The running stitch by the way the machine is set up in the settings is not an option at the beginning in that area, but there is a way you can create your own running stitch by just choosing the straight stitch, making it a very short stitch length, and use it as a way to toggle between 2 different stitches. So you can save that as your own running stitch for the beginning of a stitch. What was the part of the question?
Oh, I may have scrolled down. There's so many questions. I'm not.
Sarah, did
does
you have
running lock stitch work at the beginning and the end?
I think you have to. It works at the end as a choice, but I don't think it is there. I don't think there's a securing stitch button on the head of the machine that could do it there.
Yeah.
That could toggle between that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there was interest about the number of times the thread passes through the needle. You mentioned that.
Amazing.
I always think that's such a great stat. Does the stitch length change the number of times the thread goes through the needle?
Yes, it does. So whenever I said it was 120 through the eye of the needle, that was at a default stitch length of 2.5. Depending on if your stitch length is shorter or longer, that number changes. Yes.
Does thread have an expiration date?
Not.
I wish it did. Only because people keep everything forever. Such colors are memories sometimes, I know.
Yeah.
I think thread should have an expiration date because some of those older threads just don't. Especially if it's cotton.
Yeah, the best way I heard it once from Metler being explained, is that if you have a natural fiber, you think about an apple. If you leave an apple on a shelf in the sunshine for several weeks, and I think that could also apply to natural fibers as well. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah. What thread do you recommend in the bobbin when using metallic threads?
I personally, I do testing depending on what the project is. So I have used all sorts of things. So I have used metallic on the top and isocord in the bottom. I've used bobbin thread in the bottom. I've not used cotton. I don't think that would match it very well, personally. I've even used metallic in the bobbin. Like, I think it's all about that. Here's where that testing thing comes into play. It's up to you. If you like how it looks, that's really all that matters. Bernina doesn't really give you that, like, oh, you must do it this way because we say it's best. It's, your choice. If you like it, that's all that matters. I don't know. What do you use, Sarah?
Yeah, I agree with you. It depends so much on the project and whether they're going to see the back side of the project. And I stick with usually a polyester type of thread because it's stronger. But I think I play around with all sorts of things. I totally agree with you, Debbie, when you talked about how sometimes this machine gets a bit of a bad name. But
It does.
because I sew with everything, I don't have an issue. Even these old threads that I've kept for memories, I bring them out and I make them work.
Well, absolutely. I just think it's a matter of taking the time to figure out what works best for you based upon the project at hand.
Exactly. It's like baking. Sometimes you
Yeah.
have to tweak it a little bit to suit your oven temperature or
Yeah. And I honestly think there's a journey to be had. And I think part of the love of what we do is that step by step, that journey. And I think it's okay to learn things along the way and find what works best for you.
Yeah,
that's right.
totally.
That's right. And
Well,
it's fantastic.
sorry.
No, I was just going to agree.
What is stacked thread? This is a new term from one of our attendees.
Oh, okay. Stacked thread is, here, I'll show you. See how it's straight across on the spool? That's stacked or flat wound. I mean, it has different terms, right? So I think in Europe, they call it radial thread.
Yeah, or horizontal.
Horizontal. And then the opposite of that is crisscross. I don't know if you can see that. See how it's crisscross wound on the spool? It's not flat across. So that's stacked thread.
Thanks. Let me see. Someone says, does the older 880 come with the added spool pin for horizontal release? I've never seen this adapter before. I think they're talking about that photo.
Oh, that thing that was across. I actually can't remember if that came in the box with the machine or if that was an accessory I bought.
I think I don't think it's included with any of the machines yet,
Okay.
but it's a good one.
It is a good one. Yeah, I didn't remember it being in the box, but thank you.
There's lots of things in the box, but
that isn't one of them. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, but that's a good tool if you're going to use those flat wound or stacked threads.
So there's been a few questions about invisible thread. Do you have any recommendations for that? Where would you place it in your spool stand? Those are mostly the two questions on invisible thread. Let me see, I think there was another one. There's always a lot of questions on invisible thread.
So invisible thread is not something I use a lot. But that's just because the techniques one would use that for are not things I have been doing in recent time. And so, so the reason I used that extra accessory that I attached to the machine was because if you put that spool on a regular vertical spool stand and put it through that hole in the partition between the regular spools and the bobbin one, there might be too much tension on that invisible thread, which stretches like crazy, right? And so that's why that extra that sat it off to the side was a better option for invisible thread release. So you can try it the regular way, but you would have to feed it through that hole and up to your tension, your thread guide, and you might find it snapping and breaking, and that would, you might need to go to the accessory pin that holds it out to the side on the horizontal. Was there another part to that question that I didn't answer?
Sometimes, I mean, there's just a few things. I think I'm going to pass along feedback that maybe we should do a webinar on invisible thread because I see these questions all the time. There's another one about thread tension with invisible thread, and I would just adjust your tension if you're seeing thread from the bottom or thread from the top, whatever way you're seeing the thread you don't want to see, adjust your tension.
Yep, for sure.
I saw there was a couple of questions as I was looking before regarding the stitch plate that I talked about and the marking. I've got a little green sticky. It's not so professional as the beautiful web PowerPoint, but you can see here, there's a line that runs from the outside just in a little part, and that's where the needle is. And then there's another line that goes behind, so it's behind the hole, and that's where you start. And it's interesting just to note that when you do reverse, you're going to, if you start in a little bit, just reverse back and then you go forward again. It means you don't have to reverse so far back to the start of that thread. So it comes back to that, whether you're starting in the ear or starting on the fabric person.
See, yeah, so Sarah and I are trainers, so we're telling you to do it this way, FYI.
There's another question. They really want to just see the horizontal spool attachment. So maybe if you can flip back to that part of the presentation, that would be
yeah, for sure.
Good.
Just while you're finding that, there was a question earlier on regarding when you put on the foot number 4D, which is the zipper foot, that the needle position is in the center. The machine is not clever enough unless you use the tutorial to know which side you want to sew your zipper in with. So that's why it's in the middle. So you just have to move the needle position left or right.
And this, the stitch line would be red. It wouldn't actually sew.
No, it's a warning to say change your needle position.
Okay, so we only have a few 4 minutes. I always like to bring one of the more interesting questions out. What is your opinion about keeping threads in the refrigerator prior to sewing? I've never heard that one.
I've heard it, but I've never tried it, so I have no opinion on it either way because I've never done it.
I've heard a lot about that in countries that are very humid or very dry, and they want to keep dry, I should say, to keep the humidity in the thread or the moisture in the thread. The other point is I see these fabulous sewing rooms with these beautiful thread stands out in the daylight, and I don't know, but I believe that keeping your thread in a dark place is a good idea if you have a big investment in threads. Yeah. It looks beautiful on display, but yeah, it depends on how much light you have in your room and how much window light coming in, I think.
Because they fade? Do you think they fade?
They fade, and I think they
degrade. I think they degrade from the UV light.
Yeah.
We got a lot of questions about thread. I encourage all of you to reach out. A lot of the thread manufacturers have great webinars all about thread, so you can get a lot more answers there too.
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
that's a great ending to this webinar because it's always the machine's fault.
and usually it's really not.
And it's absolutely not. And I always laugh about that.
Yeah, it's like kind of like it's a perfect recipe between the machine, the needle, and the thread, right? Like the needle and the thread really have to match, and your machine will be able to do it. So you can
Right.
think of your machine as the KitchenAid mixer, and you just have to make sure you get complementary things in the bowl with the thread and the needle, and you'll have the perfect
Yeah,
combination.
the right attachment to make the eggs or the cream or the,
Yeah.
yeah. You can tell I'm
Yeah.
Well,
getting
thank you
hungry.
so much for both of you joining us again today and all of our attendees. There are no handouts for this session, but we will post recordings of this in the next day or two on BERNINA.com. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email. We're so happy you joined us this morning. Thank you.
We'll see you this afternoon.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Looking forward
this
to it.
afternoon.
See
Oh
you.
my gosh.
3
Bye.
o'clock Central.
Bye.
3 o'clock Central.
Bye, everyone.